Aquarius. Welcome back, my friends. Thank you for spending a little of your time with me today. This is a general reading, so take what speaks to your heart and leave what doesn't. We're going to explore the energy surrounding your connection, what's changing beneath the surface, and why someone may be finding it harder and harder to ignore what they truly feel. And honestly, before I even pull the cards, it feels like there's someone who thought they could simply move on, someone who believed distance would make everything quieter. But instead, your energy seems to be showing up everywhere they go. Okay, let's see what's happening here. The first thing I'm noticing is that somebody has been trying very hard to keep themselves busy. Busy with work, busy with responsibilities, busy with life. You know, the kind of busy that isn't really about productivity at all. It's the kind of busy that people create when they're trying not to think about something or someone. And yet every time they finally sit down at the end of the day, every time the noise fades and everything becomes still, somehow you find your way back into their thoughts. Not because they're trying to think about you. Honestly, I don't think they are. I actually feel the opposite. I feel like this person has spent a lot of time trying not to. But there's something about your energy that lingers. It's subtle, it's quiet. It doesn't force itself into the room. It just stays. Almost like a song they haven't heard in months suddenly playing somewhere in the distance. And as I'm sitting with this energy, the star is right here, and what strikes me isn't even the card itself, it's the feeling around it. It's this strange awareness that no matter how many people they've met, no matter how many distractions they've placed in front of themselves, nobody seems to create the same feeling that you do. That's what keeps catching them off guard. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be the connection that stayed in their mind long after everything else faded into the background. Yet here they are, still thinking, still wondering, still remembering. And I keep hearing someone say, why do I keep coming back to this? Not necessarily coming back to a relationship, not necessarily coming back to a conversation, but coming back to a feeling. Because when they think about you, Aquarius, they don't immediately remember specific words. They don't replay every text message. They don't obsess over every detail. What they remember is how they felt around you. That's what keeps resurfacing. For some of you, this person remembers feeling lighter, more relaxed, more themselves, like they didn't have to perform, like they didn't have to impress anybody, like they could simply exist. And that's becoming more important than they realized, because life has a way of showing us what matters by showing us what is missing. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. The Six of Cups just feels incredibly present, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that feels overwhelming. It's more like little moments slipping through the cracks, a random memory while driving, a familiar song, a place they've walked past 100 times before that suddenly reminds them of you. The strange thing is that these memories don't feel forced. They're just appearing naturally. And every time they do, this person seems to pause for a second longer than they normally would, almost as if they're beginning to realize that what they felt wasn't as temporary as they once convinced themselves it was. Because I keep getting this image of someone looking out a window and becoming distracted by a thought they weren't expecting. And the thought isn't complicated. It's simple. It's just you. The way you laughed, the way you looked at them, the way conversations felt easy, the way they never felt judged, the way they could breathe. You know, Aquarius has this unique energy. There's something very freeing about it. People often expect freedom to mean distance, but your energy feels different. Your energy says you can be exactly who you are here. And honestly, that's rare. Much rarer than most people realize. Which brings me to the Lovers. Because this card arrived with a completely different feeling. This doesn't feel like someone obsessing. It doesn't feel like somebody caught up in fantasy. It feels more like somebody slowly becoming honest with themselves. That's the energy. Honesty. Not necessarily honesty spoken out loud. Not yet. But honesty happening internally. The kind that arrives when there are no distractions left. When all the excuses begin to sound weaker than they used to. When the story they've been telling themselves no longer feels convincing. And I think that's where this person is. They're beginning to acknowledge that this connection affected them more deeply than they expected. Not because you demanded anything from them. Not because you chased them. Not because you tried to force your way into their life. But because something about you felt real. And real is hard to forget. Especially in a world where so much feels temporary. Okay. And the more I sit with these cards, the more I feel this person trying to understand something. Not understand you. Understand themselves. Understand why your energy continues to echo through their thoughts long after they believed everything would settle down. Because part of them genuinely expected time to erase this. Part of them expected life to move forward and carry them somewhere else. yet somehow your presence remains, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, steadily. Like a light they keep noticing in the distance, no matter which direction they turn. And honestly, I feel like they're only beginning to understand why. Because the energy changes when someone stops running from their own thoughts. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It's more like standing in a room you've walked through 100 times and suddenly noticing something that was always there. And that's what I feel happening around this connection. The hermit is here now, and honestly, this doesn't feel lonely to me. It feels quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long season of noise. The kind of quiet where there are no distractions left to blame. No busy schedules, no convenient excuses, no endless list of things to focus on instead. Just a person sitting with themselves and realizing they can't keep outthinking their own heart. You know, I think this person believed that if they gave themselves enough time, everything would eventually sort itself out. That distance would provide answers. That stepping back would somehow make things simpler. But what happened instead is that the silence started speaking. And silence has a funny way of doing that. At first, it feels empty. After a while, it starts revealing things. I keep seeing someone awake earlier than usual. Not because they're trying to be productive. Not because they have somewhere important to be. But because their mind refuses to settle. They're staring at the ceiling. Looking out a window. Holding a cup of coffee that's already gone cold. And their thoughts keep circling back to questions they haven't been able to answer. Questions about choices. Questions about feelings. Questions about why certain people leave our lives so quickly while others continue to occupy space inside us long after the conversation ends. Okay, the Four of Swords is sitting beside the hermit, and the energy feels almost reflective, like somebody reviewing old chapters of their life. Not through the lens of blame, not through the lens of regret, just observation. And that feels important, because for a long time, I think this person was trying to explain everything logically, trying to organize emotions into neat little boxes, trying to convince themselves that every feeling needed a practical explanation before it deserved attention. But emotions rarely cooperate with that approach. Sometimes they simply exist. And the more this person tries to analyze what happened between you and them, the more they discover that certain moments carried more weight than they originally realized. A conversation that seemed ordinary at the time. A look, a laugh, a shared silence, small things. Yet those are the memories that seem to survive. Those are the moments still floating through their mind. Honestly, what surprised me most is how much this person has changed internally without saying a word about it. Because from the outside, things may appear exactly the same routines, the same habits, the same image they present to the world. But underneath all of that, something is shifting, something is softening. And I feel like they're beginning to understand that avoiding emotions doesn't actually make them disappear. It just delays the conversation. The moon is here now, and the atmosphere changes immediately. Everything becomes slower, deeper, more personal. Because there are feelings this person hasn't fully admitted yet, not necessarily to you, maybe not even to themselves. They're still uncovering them, still finding language for things they've spent a long time keeping hidden. I keep getting the image of someone opening old drawers inside their own mind, places they haven't visited in years, memories, fears, vulnerabilities. The parts of themselves they usually keep locked away from everyone else. And Aquarius, I think one reason this connection affected them so deeply is because your presence touched those hidden places without even trying. That's not something they expected. It's not something they were prepared for. Because there are people we meet who only know the version of us we show the world. And there are rare people who somehow see beyond it. Not because they force their way in, not because they demand access, but because something about them makes it feel safe to lower the walls. I think that's what keeps surfacing for this person. The realization that they felt seen, maybe more seen than they were comfortable with at the time. And now they're sitting with that awareness, trying to understand why it mattered so much. There's also this sense of exhaustion around them. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying the same internal conflict for too long. Because part of them wants certainty. Part of them wants clear answers, a clear direction, a simple explanation. Yet feelings don't always arrive with instructions attached. Sometimes all you can do is sit with them, listen to them, allow them to tell their story. And I think that's exactly where this person is. Listening. Really listening. Perhaps for the first time in a long time. Not listening to other people's opinions. Not listening to fears. Not listening to expectations. Listening to themselves. And what they're hearing is becoming harder to ignore. Because beneath all the questions, beneath all the analysis, beneath all the reasons they once gave themselves, there is still an emotional truth waiting quietly underneath. And every day they spend in this space seems to bring them a little closer to it, not rushing, not forcing, just slowly removing the layers that kept them from seeing it clearly. And the closer they get, the more I feel them realizing that some connections aren't forgotten simply because time passes. Some connections stay present because they continue teaching us something about who we are. And honestly, I don't think they've reached the end of that realization yet. Something shifts when a person finally grows tired of arguing with themselves. Not tired in the physical sense, tired in the soul, tired of carrying the same questions from one season into the next, tired of building walls around feelings that continue finding their way through anyway. And Aquarius, that's exactly where this energy seems to be standing right now. Not at a finish line, not at some dramatic turning point, but at the edge of a realization that has been approaching for a very long time. The moment I pulled judgment, the atmosphere around this reading became incredibly clear. Not louder, not more emotional, just clearer. Like fog slowly lifting from a landscape that was always there. You know, for a while I think this person believed they had more time to figure things out, more time to postpone difficult conversations, more time to avoid looking directly at what they were feeling. But life has a way of placing mirrors in front of us when we're ready to see ourselves honestly. And I keep seeing this person encountering those mirrors everywhere. Not through other people, not through advice, through their own experiences, through quiet moments when nobody else is around, through situations that unexpectedly remind them of choices they've made, through opportunities that no longer feel as satisfying as they once did, because something inside them is changing. And once that process begins, it's very difficult to go back to the person you used to be. Honestly, I don't even feel like this awakening is centered entirely around love. That's what's interesting. It feels bigger than that. Love is part of it. You are part of it. But the transformation itself feels deeply personal, as if they're finally asking themselves questions they avoided for years. Questions about happiness, questions about authenticity, questions about what kind of life they're actually trying to build. And every answer seems to bring them back to the same uncomfortable truth. They've spent too much energy protecting themselves from experiences they secretly wanted. The fear made sense once. Maybe it even served a purpose. Maybe it helped them survive difficult chapters. Maybe it helped them avoid disappointment. But now, the fear feels outdated. Like a coat they're still wearing long after winter has ended. And that's where death enters the reading. The energy around this card feels powerful. Not chaotic, not destructive, powerful. Because I don't see someone losing themselves. I see someone shedding versions of themselves. Versions that no longer fit. Versions built around old wounds, old assumptions, old expectations. The strange thing is that this process isn't happening because somebody forced it. It isn't happening because they were pressured. It's happening because they're beginning to see the cost of remaining the same. Okay, I want to explain what I mean. Imagine standing in front of a door you've wanted to open for years. You tell yourself you'll do it eventually. You tell yourself you'll wait until the timing feels perfect, until you're completely ready, until there's no uncertainty left. But one day you realize the waiting itself has become its own prison. And suddenly the fear of staying where you are becomes greater than the fear of moving forward. That's the feeling I'm getting here. This person isn't being pushed by desperation. They're being pulled by growth. Pulled by the realization that avoiding vulnerability doesn't actually create freedom. It creates distance. Distance from other people. Distance from opportunities. Distance from parts of yourself. And I think that's something they're finally beginning to understand. Because for the longest time, freedom may have looked like independence. No expectations, no emotional risk, no possibility of getting hurt. But now the definition is changing. Now freedom looks more like honesty. The freedom to feel something without apologizing for it. The freedom to care. The freedom to choose connection without feeling trapped by it. And that realization is transforming everything. The Ace of Swords appears here almost like a breath of fresh air after a long period of confusion. I keep seeing someone sitting alone and suddenly understanding something that had been sitting right in front of them all along. Not because new information arrived, because their perspective changed, and perspective changes everything. The same situation can look completely different when you're finally willing to see it without fear speaking on your behalf. That's what keeps standing out to me. The fear isn't leading anymore. It's still there. Of course it is. But it no longer seems to be sitting in the driver's seat. And because of that, thoughts that once felt impossible are beginning to feel approachable. Conversations that once felt overwhelming no longer seem so frightening. Possibilities that once felt unrealistic are starting to feel worthy of consideration. I keep hearing somebody quietly admit something to themselves. Not out loud, not publicly, just internally. The kind of admission that changes everything even before a single word is spoken. Because every major shift begins there, inside, before anybody else notices, before actions change, before circumstances change, before outcomes change. There is always a private moment where a person finally tells themselves the truth. And Aquarius, that private moment feels very close. It feels like someone standing in front of a new chapter with their hand resting on the first page. Not rushing, not forcing anything. Simply recognizing that they can no longer pretend they don't see what's right in front of them. And the deeper they step into this version of themselves, the more I feel them discovering something unexpected. What they truly wanted was never freedom from love. It was the freedom to experience love without fear deciding the rules. There comes a point when watching from a distance stops feeling comfortable. Not because anything external changes, because something internal refuses to stay still anymore. And Aquarius, that's the sensation I'm picking up now. A growing restlessness, a growing awareness. Almost like somebody standing on the shoreline for so long that eventually they realize they've spent more time observing the ocean than actually living their life. And that realization carries weight, because I don't feel hesitation the way I felt before. I feel movement. Small movement, yes. Careful movement, but movement all the same. The King of Cups appears, and immediately the energy becomes steadier, more mature, less reactive. This person isn't caught in emotional chaos anymore. They're not bouncing between extremes. What I see is someone learning how to sit with their feelings without trying to fight them. And honestly, that's a bigger shift than most people realize. For some people, expressing emotion comes naturally. For others, it feels like learning an entirely different language. Every feeling has to be translated, examined, questioned, verified, especially for someone who has spent years trusting logic more than vulnerability. But lately, I feel like they're beginning to understand that emotional intelligence isn't about suppressing what you feel. It's about carrying it with honesty. It's about allowing your heart to exist without letting fear dictate every decision. You know, I keep seeing this image of someone rereading messages they never answered, thinking about conversations they never finished, replaying moments they once brushed aside because they seemed easier to ignore than confront. And what's interesting is that these memories don't feel painful anymore. They feel important. There's a difference. Pain makes people run. Importance makes people pay attention. And this person is paying attention now, very closely. Okay. The Ace of Pentacles is sitting here, and the atmosphere around it feels incredibly grounded. Not fantasy, not wishful thinking, grounded. I don't think they're interested in temporary emotions anymore. I don't think they're interested in situations that leave everything hanging in uncertainty. What they're beginning to crave is something real, something that can actually exist outside their imagination, something that can be touched, built, experienced, because there comes a moment when dreams alone stop being enough. And I think they're reaching that moment. For a long time, it may have felt safer to keep everything in the realm of possibility, because possibilities can't disappoint you the way reality can. Possibilities don't require vulnerability. Possibilities don't ask anything of you. But real connections do. Real connections ask for honesty. They ask for presence. They ask for effort. And I feel this person slowly accepting that truth. Not because somebody forced them, because they're beginning to want it for themselves. Honestly, there's something beautiful happening here, because the energy doesn't feel rushed. It feels intentional. The difference matters. Rushed energy comes from panic. Intentional energy comes from clarity. And I keep sensing someone who is becoming increasingly clear about what matters to them. Not what should matter. Not what other people expect to matter. What genuinely matters. The Emperor arrives, and suddenly, I see somebody sitting with a completely different posture. Not physically, energetically. They're carrying themselves differently, thinking differently, approaching their life differently. Because there's a growing desire to take ownership of their choices, to stop allowing circumstances to make decisions for them, to stop waiting for perfect conditions, to stop assuming that uncertainty automatically means stop. And Aquarius, I think part of this shift involves you, not because you're controlling it, not because you're creating it, but because your presence seems connected to a larger lesson they're learning about themselves. A lesson about courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage, the courage to acknowledge feelings, the courage to communicate, the courage to risk being understood. You know, I keep hearing somebody say, I don't want to spend another year wondering. And that sentence feels significant, because wondering can become a habit. A person can spend years standing at the edge of a decision, analyzing every possible outcome. Years imagining conversations instead of having them. Years studying possibilities instead of living them. At some point, the mind runs out of new questions, and all that's left is action. That's the feeling surrounding this energy. Not immediate action, not reckless action, but preparation, mental preparation, emotional preparation. The kind that happens before somebody finally takes a step they've been contemplating for far too long. There's also a surprising tenderness here. A softer side of this person that may not be visible to many people. Because beneath all the thinking, beneath all the planning, beneath all the careful consideration, I sense somebody who genuinely cares, much more deeply than they usually allow others to see. And that tenderness seems to be surfacing more often now, in unexpected moments, in quiet reflections, in the way they think about the future. Because the future itself is beginning to look different. Less focused on self-protection, more focused on meaningful connection, less concerned with maintaining emotional distance, more interested in creating emotional presence. And I think that's why this energy feels so important. Not because somebody has all the answers. Not because every uncertainty has disappeared, but because the direction of their heart is becoming harder to misunderstand. The more they listen to themselves, the more they recognize that observing life from the sidelines is no longer enough. Something inside them wants participation, wants honesty, wants a chance to discover what could happen when both logic and emotion are finally allowed to sit at the same table. And the closer they move toward that realization, the stronger this desire for genuine connection seems to become. A doorway appears long before anyone decides to walk through it. That's the image coming into my mind right now. Not a dramatic doorway, not something glowing or impossible to miss. Just a simple opening standing quietly in front of someone who finally realizes they don't have to remain where they've been. And Aquarius, the energy surrounding this connection feels remarkably different. Softer, lighter, not because all the questions have disappeared, because the resistance is beginning to fade. You know, sometimes people spend so much time preparing themselves for change that they don't notice they've already started changing. I think that's part of what's happening here. This person isn't standing in the same emotional landscape anymore. The things that once felt impossible now seem approachable. The things that once felt frightening no longer hold the same power. And with that shift comes possibility, real possibility. The Fool arrives, and immediately I get the feeling of somebody standing at the beginning of a road they never expected to consider. There's curiosity here, a willingness to explore, a willingness to trust themselves a little more than they used to. Honestly, that's what feels most important. Not trusting circumstances, not trusting outcomes, trusting themselves. Because fear often convinces people they aren't capable of handling uncertainty. But growth teaches something very different. Growth teaches you that uncertainty isn't the enemy. It's simply part of every meaningful experience. And I feel like this person is beginning to understand that. They're realizing that waiting until every risk disappears means waiting forever. Waiting until every answer arrives means never asking the question. Waiting until every doubt is gone means never moving at all. And for somebody who has spent so much time standing still internally, this emerging willingness to move feels incredibly significant. Okay, the star appears again. And I love seeing it here, because the feeling around it is completely different now. Earlier, it felt distant, reflective, like something being observed from far away. Now it feels closer, more personal, more alive. I keep sensing somebody looking toward the future instead of constantly examining the past. And that's a beautiful thing, because healing isn't always about understanding every detail of what happened. Sometimes healing is deciding where you want to go from here. Sometimes healing is allowing hope to have a seat at the table again. And Aquarius, hope seems to be returning. Quietly, naturally, without force. The image I keep seeing is someone opening their curtains after a long stretch of cloudy weather. Nothing dramatic changes in that moment. The room is still the same room. The furniture is still in the same place. But the light changes everything, and that's what this energy feels like. A change in light, a change in perspective, a change in the way possibilities are viewed. There's also a sincerity here that wasn't present before. The kind of sincerity that emerges when somebody becomes tired of performing versions of themselves that no longer feel authentic. Because I think this person is beginning to crave authenticity more than comfort, and that's a powerful realization. Comfort keeps us safe. Authenticity helps us grow. The Lovers appears, and what stands out to me isn't romance. It's choice, a conscious choice, a deliberate choice. The understanding that meaningful connections don't survive because people accidentally drift toward them. They survive because somebody chooses to show up, chooses to participate, chooses to remain present. And I feel like this person is reaching a point where choices matter more than fears, where intentions matter more than assumptions, where honesty matters more than self-protection. You know, There's something incredibly mature about this energy, because it doesn't feel like somebody trying to recreate the past. It doesn't feel like somebody chasing old memories. What I see is someone recognizing that they are not the same person they used to be, and perhaps more importantly, recognizing that you aren't either. Life changes people. Experiences shape them. Time teaches lessons that can only be learned through living. And because of that, this connection feels less focused on what was lost and more focused on what could be created now. The Queen of Pentacles arrives with such a grounded presence. Everything suddenly feels stable, practical, real, and that's refreshing. Because emotions are beautiful, but emotions alone aren't enough. There has to be something sustainable beneath them. Something that can support growth over time. Something that exists beyond attraction, beyond longing, beyond imagination. I think this person is beginning to appreciate that. They're beginning to value consistency, reliability, emotional maturity, the simple beauty of showing up honestly. And Aquarius, I don't think they're seeing you through the lens of fantasy anymore. I think they're seeing you as a real person, a person with strengths and flaws, dreams and fears, a person whose presence has carried meaning through every stage of this internal journey. Honestly, that realization feels more valuable than any idealized version of love ever could, because real connections become stronger when they are viewed clearly, not through projection, not through illusion, through truth. And what fascinates me is that the energy keeps moving toward openness, toward expression, toward a willingness to say things that may have remained unspoken for a very long time. Not because anybody is being pressured, not because somebody suddenly has all the answers, but because there comes a point when sincerity feels lighter than silence, and I keep sensing somebody standing very close to that threshold, looking toward a future that no longer feels intimidating, looking toward a connection that no longer feels impossible to acknowledge, looking toward themselves with a level of honesty they may not have had before. And the more comfortable they become with that truth, the more naturally everything else seems to unfold around it. Aquarius. I think the beautiful thing about this energy is that nobody has to force what's already finding its way to the surface. Some truths arrive quietly. Some feelings take time to understand. And some connections reveal their meaning little by little, one realization at a time. Wherever you are in your journey, be gentle with yourself. Give yourself the same patience you've given everyone else. And remember, growth rarely happens all at once. It happens in small moments that slowly change the way we see ourselves and the people we care about. That's all I've got for you for this reading. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I appreciate you more than you know. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I'll see you again very soon. Okay, my friends, bye for now.